Good afternoon, everyone. We're so excited that you're joining us. I'm Amy Dacey, the Executive Director of the Sign Institute at American University. The Sign Institute was established in 2018. We're an incubator for policy innovation, and we like to convene the best minds from public sectors, private sectors, nonprofit, journalism, and academia. It's a university-wide initiative, and we're very excited today to be joined by the U.S. Mexico Foundation, which is a binational organization dedicated to fostering bilateral cooperation and understanding between the U.S. and Mexico. It's an organization I know well. I've been on a delegation trip with the U.S. Mexico Foundation. I'm really impressed with their programming, and we're so glad that they were willing to join us today to talk about a really important topic. Today's conversation will offer an overview of the economic and social consequences of COVID-19 on migration between the U.S. and Mexico. We are very fortunate to have our esteemed guests today, but I think I'd like to start right off by letting my colleague, Enrique Paret, from the director from the U.S. Mexico Foundation, introduce our esteemed guest and start the conversation. Enrique, it's good to see you, even if virtually. I look forward to seeing you again in person soon.
Good to see you, Amy. Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone. I have the honor to introduce our two guest speakers, and I'll start with Doris Meissner. She is currently a senior fellow and director of the U.S. Immigration Policy Program at the MPI, the Migration Policy Institute. And Doris, well, she's a former commissioner of the INS, that is the Immigration and Naturalization Service, from the year 1993 to the year 2000. Welcome, Doris. And I also want to welcome you, Gerónimo Gutiérrez, former ambassador from Mexico to the US. And he's now currently a managing partner at Bell Infrastructure. And he's also a consultant here in Washington and back in Mexico. He has been Undersecretary for North America, Undersecretary for Latin America, and Undersecretary of the Interior. And also he is former president of the North American Development Bank. Welcome, Gerónimo.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm gonna give you the word for 10 minutes each. And let's say an introduction words from your side, and then we're gonna go to Q&As with the public, with the audience, okay? Let's start with you, Doris.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Enrique. Thank you for inviting me to do this, and always very nice to see you, Gerónimo, and I'm looking forward to a good back and forth. So starting out with the U.S. side of the topic today of COVID-19 and the southern border, I think it's impossible really to talk about the COVID-19 issue in the southern border without also talking a bit about pre-COVID-19, because there's been a tremendous amount that's been going on around the U.S.-Mexico relationship, particularly the southern border. So let me try to very quickly run through what I think the context needs to be. And that context starts, I think, with a very essential point that we have to really recognize, and that is, of course, that there possibly would not even be a President Trump or a Trump administration in the United States were it not for the southern border and for Mexico. Those issues actually contributed as much to Trump's campaign and to his election as any of the issues. We all recall, of course, his announcement dubbing Mexican migrants as murderers and rapists. And of course, we remember the rallying cry of the campaign, build the wall, which audiences became more and more enamored of finding a way of shouting throughout the campaign. And the way in which that campaign was run and the way in which those issues were used only really magnifies how controversial issues of immigration are in the United States and the way this particular political leader chose to exploit them and leverage them politically. But you know, campaigns are one thing, governing is something else. And generally, when we see campaigns, they do one thing and governing does another thing. That's not been the case with this administration. With this administration, the campaign has become the governing playbook, and the devotion that the administration has to being able to say that it's kept its promises has really endured throughout these 3 years. And so we've seen a whole host of actions in the immigration arena throughout the administration. Many of them dealing with Mexico, many of them dealing with other parts of the world, but the things that have been particularly important and significant where Mexico is concerned are very significant changes in interior enforcement policy in the United States, which has led to large numbers of deportations, changes in policy to prosecute all crossers at the southwest border, which led to the very, very serious issue of separation of families in the early years of the administration. Using the powers of the Attorney General, this administration has tightly, has narrowed the definitions for political asylum and the ability to gain political asylum in the United States for people crossing the southwest border. It even went so far as to shut down the government for the longest partial shutdown in our history over funding of the wall project. And then when the Congress wouldn't fund the wall project, the president turned to national emergency powers in order to gain funding from our national defense programs. There, of course, has been the issue of the caravans for Central America and the drumbeat that the president used in the lead up to our 2018 off-year elections. And although that didn't change the election outcomes, it nonetheless was a very, very well-worn political strategy by that time. That's led to return agreements that the administration has signed with Central American countries. And of course, through all of this, there's been very strong domestic pushback, primarily with litigation. Many of the actions the administration has taken have been stopped, but particularly where the DACA population is concerned, TPS populations. But those victories may very well be short-lived because as those cases get to the Supreme Court, where they now are, it's highly likely that the Supreme Court will in fact uphold the president and the executive branch's authority to take those actions. The actions have also included legal immigration, regulations to tighten what's called public charge, heavier focus on finding fraud in applications for benefits under our legal immigration system. And you know, where Mexico is concerned, of course, the flows from Central America coming through Mexico have been a continuing concern, and ultimately led the administration to take what I think we would think of in the United States, probably in Mexico you do too, as the nuclear option of threatening tariffs and basically stopping trade between our two countries. So where that final point came about, I think it's fair to say that Mexico blinked. I'm sure Gerónimo will have more to say about all of that. But the result was a migration collaboration agreement. And that agreement has allowed the president to further tell the American people that he's doing everything that he possibly can to deal with immigration across the southwest border, and to do it in a way that is showing the American people he's defending them from the harms of that he believes immigration brings to Americans. Now, that is, that is the backdrop, I think, for COVID and for what has happened now that we're in this pandemic. Because what's happened with this pandemic against that backdrop is that although the administration has been quite successful in shutting down many aspects of migration across the southwest border, it hasn't been entirely successful. And what COVID has done is really, I would argue, provided the rationale for a final set of steps to be put into place to do what the goal has always been, and that has basically been to shut down movement across the U.S. Mexico border, certainly unauthorized movement, but a good deal of what we would think of as legal authorized movement as well. So, of course, the pandemic is global. Of course, we know that it doesn't pick and choose. But at the end of the day, the border and Mexico were not at all among the early hotspots that a real strategic approach to dealing with the virus in the United States would have involved. But the administration did treat the southwest border as one of the most serious dangers to the country. And it has used the pandemic as a vehicle for further achieving its border security goals. And what that has looked like, and now does look like, and is in place, is very stringent travel restrictions and agreements with both Mexico and Canada on who will come to the United States, but very, very significantly reduced movement, reduced legal movement by restricting interviews and basically shutting down consulates that would process applications and ways to come to the country legally. And the authority under which that's been done is in fact not an immigration law authority. It's a Center for Diseases Control, a health authority. And it's an authority that dates way back in our statutes to 1944. It was renewed. It was originally established in 1893. So in periods that entirely predate what the modern procedures and legal instruments are that are enforced at the southwest border. And that CDC order and that statutory basis is one that is, of course, an emergency power that has to do with public health and public health grounds. But what it has led to is the Border Patrol exercising what's called expulsion from the country. Expulsion is a term and a procedure that has nothing to do with our immigration laws, doesn't Border Patrol haven't in any way been trained. We don't really know over time what expulsion is going to mean. But that is what is happening at the southwest border. And that's what's being used to basically stop everybody coming across between ports of entry, including non-Mexicans, which is certainly a first in our experience as two countries. So the result of all of that is that the flows really are steeply down. They're steeply down because of the ultimate deterrent of no rights being able to be exercised at the southwest border. And of course, the other ultimate deterrent here is that there are no jobs in the United States because of course, what's happening in the US economy. So that sets us up for a future that is certainly unknown at the present time. But we can say a few words, and I'll close with them, about what it is that we have learned and what it is that we might be, that we could see in the future based on what is now a really unprecedented set of actions that have taken place. I think that the starting point for thinking about the future must be to restate what we know, but really haven't adjusted to, and that is that the era of large-scale immigration from Mexico is over. I mean, that's a very broad statement, and it doesn't mean that there won't be any illegal migration from Mexico. There always will be some, probably, but there have been sufficiently wide-ranging structural changes to bring about a real change in the push factors, and it has therefore brought that established illegal migration of about a 40-year period pretty much to manageable levels. The new reality, and the new reality that we have to grapple with, is the Central American flows. And the Central American flows are, of course, a mixture of economic and protection motivations, but they are no longer young males basically seeking work in the United States. They are families and youth and families with quite young children. So that is a real challenge for both countries. Because both countries have behaved in fairly ad hoc ways in responding to this. We have not really grappled with the fuller implications that this change in the flows means and the adjustments that will be needed. And it's urgent to do that because this is a long-term enduring phenomenon, and it's something that both countries need to confront because it is part of our geographic neighborhood and it is a phenomenon within our region. So, you know, in doing so, there are a series of key ingredients that I would say both countries need to deal with, and it begins with a much greater sense of a shared future. You know, we essentially did that with NAFTA in the 1990s, and that kind of a sense of a shared future really needs to be reassessed and committed to. From the standpoint of the U.S. needs, I would argue, to restore and rebuild a meaningful asylum system at the border, but it also needs to deal with very outdated immigration laws in ways that really allow for many more legal pathways to come to the United States for employment-based purposes, both temporary and permanent. And of course, we need to get legislation to regularize the status of at least 6 million Mexicans in the United States without a legal status, as well as 4 or 5 million from other countries. 60% of whom have been here for more than 10 years. Mexico, of course, I think needs to recognize that much more fully that it's a transit and a destination country. There's a need to build government capacity as well as legal structures to deal with flows that match the need of what's coming and what we're living with. And maybe most importantly, we need to begin to work together as countries much more fully in order to deal with the issues of deterring at the source, but also closer to the source, but also providing protections and improving conditions in the region. And so that does involve asylum systems throughout the region. It involves things like in-country and regional processing. It involves anti-violence and citizen security measures in Central American countries, clearly increased economic opportunity, and better legal pathways for work purposes into our countries. This is a 10 to 20-year project. There's nothing short-term about this, and we have to face the fact that it is long-term. In an odd way, the tensions that we see right now between the countries actually could be a good starting point for a reset that allows us to move in better directions. You have a president now in Mexico, in López Obrador, that is a very different kind of a president. He's broken with a past and been willing to consider migration issues and protection issues in Mexico, but there's been a real contradiction in then the actions that have been taken. From the US side, with record unemployment and a dearth of jobs, we have to rebuild and rethink our own immigration policies and how it is that they fit into our own future. So in the best of all worlds, this could be a good moment for a reset. But even if we use that moment effectively, I would argue that on both of our parts, it's very important to bring a much better balance into place between enforcement goals and humane policies. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Doris. Let's go with you, Gerónimo. 10 minutes of introduction remarks. I think you have the mute.
There we go. Thank you, Enrique. Good morning to everybody. Let me just first thank and congratulate the U.S. Mexico Foundation and the Sign Institute for putting together this very interesting conversation and a very relevant one. And it's a pleasure to join you this morning, and it's always a pleasure to be sharing the floor with Doris Meissner. It's good to see you as always, Doris. So I have 10 minutes before I will try to point to 4 or 5 things that I think are relevant as a way of introduction. But let me first start by saying, picking up where Doris left, that I think that in spite of a very difficult context and the fact that it's a very difficult issue that the U.S. and Mexico have been trying to deal with as best as possible for a long time, I think there's an opportunity, and I will try to explain why. And I believe that these difficulties that we now face can help us move to a better place in terms of migration between Mexico and the United States. I don't think that we can never have the issue of immigration has been in our bilateral agenda for, literally decades. And I think that, the good efforts of people on both sides have not been enough. And I don't think we could be satisfied with what we have right now. So I think that it is a call, what we're now leaving, a call to both sides to try to work closer together, cooperate better, and improve what we now have on immigration. So let me point to four things that in some way or another have already been noted by Doris. The first is that the traditional narrative on the Mexican side regarding immigration has been that Mexico is a country of origin, of transit, and destined country of immigration. And while that is true, I don't think it was really until the recent past few years that Mexico really understood what being a transit and a destiny country means. The 2014-15 and the 2017-18 increase in the migration of Central American nationals into the United States going through Mexico was really a game changer. And I think that we have had 2 spikes, one in 2014-15, and then again 2017-18. And this was also coupled with changes naturally in U.S. immigration policies that started with the Trump administration. The second thing that I want to point out is that Mexico's response, our response, was also a game changer. Because in my view, for many years, even decades, Mexico had an implicit policy regarding immigration of benign neglect, where we were not taking too seriously the fact that a lot of people from Central America and elsewhere were coming through Mexico and going into the United States. And this is, however, I think the first time that we began to question this policy of benign neglect, and that we also understood that it could not continue. And I agree with Doris that the changes, the changes in immigration policy that have been presented by the Trump administration are, and other administration previously are in part, in my view, a result of that situation. And Mexico, in some, has begun to take much more seriously enforcement of its own immigration law. And I think that is good news. Mind you, a lot of people will criticize a statement like that coming from a Mexican and even a Mexican former official. But I think that we need to recognize that enforcing immigration law cannot and should not be at odds with having a humane immigration policy and protecting human rights. They cannot simply be at odds. And what has happened is you cannot go to an extreme, I think, where, people are just allowed to move absolutely freely because immigration is a universal right, and there's a conception like that, versus another view that it's just pointing to immigrants in general as the cause of all ills that are going on in a particular country. So those extremes are bad per se, in my view. And I think that they need to come closer. The fact that some changes have taken place in the last few years regarding, Mexico being, again, more serious of enforcing its own immigration law, it does provide an opportunity. What has happened is that For the first time, Mexico has taken steps. I think we need to have a better operational control of our southern border. We need to recognize, I think, as Doris was pointing out, that our institutions, our public institutions and agencies in charge of immigration are in some way surpassed by the reality, and they are underfunded and under budgeted or they're understaffed, and we need support to support them to have much better institutions. And that, in fact, in my view, would allow to have a much more, a far better immigration policy. I think that in some, Mexican migration or immigration authorities have not yet really fully shifted their focus from being basically a origin country to a transit and destiny country. And the issue of asylum that we've seen in the past few years is a very clear example, and we can talk about that a little bit more. The third point that I would stress is that, as is often pointed out today, Mexican immigration into the United States, first Mexican illegal immigration into the United States, has been drastically reduced from a peak level, I think, of the year of in the year of 2000 up to now. There's good, I think, evidence that will point to the fact that immigration, net immigration from Mexico into the United States is now negative. And if you look at the numbers provided by CBP, by the U.S. government, you'll see that undocumented illegal immigration has been drastically reduced. And why, and we can talk hours about why is that the case. But the point that I want to make is that that provides an opportunity. That provides an opportunity, I think, for Mexico and the United States to work closer together and improve and increase the avenues for mobility of Mexican nationals. And I'll be very clear in that. To the extent that Mexico has taken more seriously enforcement of its own immigration law, I think that it's also incumbent upon the U.S. government to work closer with Mexico in improving the legal avenues for migrate. I often said that Mexicans don't have a chip implanted into themselves that forces them to go and just cross into the United States. That's not the case. If there are legal avenues, by and large, people will choose those legal avenues. The push factors are important also, but if you see the reduction on Mexican nationals coming into the United States through the southern border from the year 2000 to 2000 and pretty much up till now, I think it's a combination of enforcement, but also the fact that conditions in Mexico improved and people were having, better conditions there. And the other part of the equation is to have avenues or better avenues for people to use them. And then you can really concentrate on any security threat or any other problem regarding immigration. And I think that there is an opportunity in that regard, because the numbers, we've moved from a situation where the number of Mexican nationals that came through the southern border into the United States was roughly 1.7 million in the year 2000. The number of apprehensions, perhaps events, not necessarily people, and it's 10% of what, we have now 10% of that. And that, I think the comment made by Doris is correct. We are now at a manageable number where we can probably sit down and find out ways to improve in a way that both parties, both sides will be better satisfied. And the fourth point that I want to make and give us much time to questions is that all of these that we have commented so far was pretty much based on a pre-pandemic scenario. How will this change? The answer, I think, is we can only speculate at this moment. We don't know exactly how those things change. But there are three issues that I want to highlight that I think are relevant and that show a little bit of what could happen. And let me try to describe them as, in terms of the good, the bad, and the ugly. So the good thing is that, and I'll point to something, people saw temporary agricultural workers from Mexico that are keep as of today putting food on the tables of Americans and working the fields in the United States. And you saw the Department of Homeland Security talk about these workers and define these workers as essential. So what I want to emphasize is that even if in a post, COVID or in a COVID environment with a lot of political sensitivities involved, it was recognized that there is a need to have temporary, avenues for temporary movement between our countries, and that will make us both better off. So that's the good part. I'll just point to that specific example. The bad part is that we've seen, as Doris went through, a series of restrictions, and some of them might be sensible in the face of a very grave pandemic that has hit the whole world. And I don't have enough elements to judge them, but we cannot just simply rely on restriction as we move forward. And the bad part, I think, or the ugly part, is that you begin to see expressions again to blame immigrants for every ill thing that is happening in the United States. And that is, I don't think that is fair, and I don't think that is just, and I don't think that's what defines the United States. And I would just urge to be very careful about, in this scenario, to open the door to general statements about blaming immigrants for whatever is the difficulties are going on through. I'll stop there, Enrique, so we can have as much time for questions and answer. And thank you again for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Gerónimo. I'll invite everyone in the audience to start to make some comments or questions through the Q&A box in your screen. I will start with a question for you, and I'll start with you, Doris. And my question is, it's about the moment, and I mean, to reactivate. Let's go in the future, next weeks, next months, to reactivate the economy here in the U.S. You need the immigrants, right? I mean, they are involved in every industry, from agriculture, like Gerónimo mentioned, to the gig economy, healthcare, construction, services, et cetera, and et cetera. How can you use this need of immigrants reactivating the economy in the U.S. to move forward on this opportunity to change things for groups like the DACAs and for groups like the temporary workers or the undocumented?
Well, I think that there are a variety of different answers to that based on, to some extent, the groups, because the DACA situation, for example, is very different from the situation of agricultural workers in either those that have visas and many that don't have visas. I do think, let me just say a word about DACA, and then let's go to the more general question of the economy overall. I mean, on the DACA question, of course, we're now waiting on the Supreme Court, and any day we should get a ruling. The fact that we haven't had a ruling is telling us something in any event. In other words, that the justices may well be struggling with this issue because the case was argued last fall and those decisions by and large are already out. So I think it's fair to say that the DACA case may very well be probably, let's say, one of the top 5 most consequential decisions of this term. And it is likely to go into June when the final decisions are delivered. There is more and more of a view that the Supreme Court does not want to fully decide this issue, doesn't want to in any way contribute in terms of the court's credibility to a very political issue in an election year. And so the longer that we don't have a decision, there's a sense that the court will duck it by remanding the case back to the lower courts and pushing it off until after the election. So that's a very, specific kind of a path and policy arena. If the Supreme Court does decide what most legal scholars believe, which is that it upholds the president's authority to both create DACA as well as therefore stop DACA, then the issue does kick to the Congress, because the only then real answer is legislation. And, and that, of course, would be a very difficult lift right now. But we do have an election coming up in fall, in November, and the outcome of that election could make a very, very big difference in the circumstances of the DACA population. Even if the Supreme Court does say that the program can end, those people who are currently in it would not have it end just immediately. It would end when their work authorizations end, which stretches it out over time. So that's very, that's on its own track. The more general issue of the economy, yes, of course we know that foreign-born workers, particularly Mexican people in the United States without a legal status, are very important to the economy. But making that case in the face of more than 20 million unemployed Americans, even though those of us who work with these issues know that there are serious, that there are ways that you have to understand how to disaggregate this, making that case in general will be far more difficult now as part of economic recovery than before the pandemic took place and this kind of economic pain set in for so many industries. You pointed out correctly all of the different sectors of the economy that rely on immigrants. And with that analysis, the more that we understand that analysis, the more we see that foreign-born and the unauthorized in particular are overrepresented in some of the really critical areas of the economy, particularly healthcare, that have been affected by the virus, but they're also overrepresented in the parts of the economy that have been hurt the hardest, the service sector, restaurants, tourism. And so how the U.S. finds a way forward with the kind of unemployment that we have and job loss that we have is going to be very difficult. And I think that it's fair to say that it will really have to depend on employers making the case, because we certainly don't have right now any evidence to believe that our current administration is going to be open to those kinds of arguments. If the administration does change after the election, then I think there is more of potential for some real nuance in how it is that immigration fits into recovery, but we won't know that until later in the fall.
Thank you, Doris. We have some questions already in the box of Q&A, but I will make you a question to you, Gerónimo. The Hispanic community, it's probably one of the most vulnerable community right now in the U.S., both in the healthcare issue, but also in the economy. Do you see a lot of Mexicans or even Central Americans returning to their countries because the lack of jobs available in the U.S. and Mexico, for example, relies a lot on remittances, right? We saw a spike in the March remittances to Mexico, but a lot of analysis are showing us that probably April and May will have a lower number or amount of remittances to Mexico, and that's because they are losing their jobs and they need to save some. Do you see this trend?
Enrique, I think that first of all, what Doris says, it's true that Hispanics and Mexicans in the United States, to the extent that they are considered within that group, are proportionally more working, in bigger numbers in those sectors that have been harder hit. Service industry, restaurants, hospitality, some of the sectors that have suffered the most. So yes, the short answer is yes. I expect that a lot of people will be returning to Mexico. That there will be some increase. I don't know to what extent, but there will be some increase in the number of people returning, because there is a clear correlation, if not causality, that when the U.S. economy is doing well, a lot more people are coming, and vice versa. So yes, you will see that, and I think it's incumbent, therefore, upon the Mexican and the U.S. government to try to, make that process as easy, as humane, and as best as possible. That certainly will happen, and you will probably see a reduction in the remittances because of that same reason. I think, I wouldn't speculate on any percentage or number, because I really don't know, but I do think that the group will be largely impacted. Now, it is important to distinguish what is a Hispanic American versus a Mexican working in the United States, and even more so a Mexican working in undocumented or unauthorized in the United States, and the impact might be different on those, certainly on those three sectors. That would be my answer, Enrique.
Thank you, Gerónimo. I'll go back to Amy with the Q&A session.
Thank you, everyone. We've got several questions. Some of them are similar, but one that stood out from Axel was, they said, hello, everybody. Do you think this pandemic will shift Mexican migration policies in a positive way? That is, to effectively integrate Central American migrants into Mexico's culture and society, not just economically.
Well, I think that what we've seen is that, let me try to answer this as fast as possible. The number of people that have, let me try to talk about two groups. First, there's a number of people that have, from Central America, especially from what it's called the Northern Triangle of Central America, that are increasingly claiming asylum in Mexico also. And there's a very dramatic spike in the number of asylum claims of Central Americans to Mexico. The last time I checked, we went to a number from, around 3,000 a few years ago to around 40,000 where we are. So I do expect that, as of that, more Central Americans will eventually return in Mexico. Now, Mexico, we pride ourselves in having a very open society. I think that we need to be more material, we need to put our money where our mouth is with respect to that, and we need to really do much more to integrate these people. But there will be an increase in the number. Now, I think that the pandemic itself it's per se limiting a lot the movement of people, both from Central America into Mexico and from Mexico into the United States. People are just, for several reasons, being more careful. When will that change again? I don't know. To be honest, I don't know.
Thank you. We have another question from Claire. She asks, how do you believe COVID-19 is changing the nature of state responsibilities at the border, in particular with respect to facilitating access to asylum?
You want to go ahead, Doris? And
Yes, I do think that in the case of the United States now, with the U.S. Mexico border and Central Americans in particular, this administration was doing everything that it possibly could to shut off access to the asylum system in the United States. And what COVID has done is basically allowed that to be fully established. I mean, fully implemented now on public health grounds. I mean, the idea that the administration had more than a year ago of MPP, the Remain in Mexico program, that asylum seekers should wait in Mexico in order to have their hearings in the United States, was such an unimaginable move from anything that's ever happened in our thinking before, in our that even would have been publicly acceptable. It actually did happen. And it's interesting that Mexico didn't protest more, because the real burden is not only on the migrants themselves, but on communities along Mexico's northern border, which are facing a lot of difficulties because of people there who are waiting. That's even more alarming now under the pandemic, but it's quite fascinating how very little real protest there has been in the United States about that policy, as compared, for instance, to the separation of families policy. And I think that it's because it's taking place in another country. There isn't a lot of reporting on it. And it is one of the few things where the courts have actually upheld the right of the administration to do it. So you have a real question about where this is ultimately going to take us as two countries, because basically we don't have an asylum system anymore in the United States at present, because of the combination along the southwest border, because of the combination of actions pre-COVID and now finally fully established with COVID. Once the pandemic wanes and the danger of the virus is less, I'm not exactly sure how we work our way back from that without also, and I think this is something, Gerónimo, that you would be concerned with in Mexico, without also inviting a real surge that will be very difficult for both countries to manage. So the ways to unwind from this are not at all clear at this point.
There's several questions.
Let me just add one other thing. But I do think that unwinding will have to include, for all of our countries, and certainly I think this will be the case in the United States, different kinds of screening measures. There are all kinds of screening measures now when people come, fingerprints, etc. But I think that we're going to be needing to develop health screening measures as part of all of our border policies, both legal and between ports of entry.
It's an incredible point, very, very important to the process and moving forward. I think there's the thread going through several questions, and that's about, sometimes when you're thrust into these challenges, you get educated a little bit better on situations. I think there's been a lot more understanding, or at least awareness of the Mexico-U.S. relationship and our food supply chain, whether it's the workers that are legally crossing the border every day in Yuma County, others that are helping to harvest and produce food that we need, but then also questions about trade and what we need coming back and forth. So I think in a way some of the questions have been about how has COVID-19, will it influence our food supply chain, and the important part that Mexico plays in that process on so many of the things that we eat in this country.
Well, I think that this situation. Let me put it this way. I think that the COVID-19 has raised, in my view, the strategic value of Mexico for the United States. And these, for different reasons. One is that businesses and governments are in fact rethinking their supply chains. And we can have a very strong debate about why and is that correct, but that's something that will happen. And therefore, in my view, I think that Mexico is well served by the fact that it is a neighbor of the United States, that we have a trade agreement with the United States, that we have actually a new trade agreement with the Trump administration that will just kick in a few months. And that provides an opportunity because Mexico has everything that is necessary to further integrate supply chains with our North American partners. And I think that's good. I think that is beginning to be better understood in the United States. And in the end, it will be business decisions guided, also by governments. But if you want to have, the example we're clearly seeing now is if you want to start the auto industry in the United States, you need to have the auto industry in Mexico start pretty much at the same time and under certain common guidelines. That's one. If you take it to the food supply, well, the last time I checked, our agriculture trade between Mexico and the United States surpasses the $40 billion. We trade a lot on all sorts of foods. Mexico buys all sorts of fruits from the United States and also meat, and we also export grains and vegetables. And so that is also important. And I think that, again, it also provides an opportunity. Now, on the movement of people, I share Doris's view that with the level of unemployment that you see everywhere, including the United States and Mexico, it's difficult to convince anybody to open more the door, to put it in some way. But this situation that we're living does provide, in my view, some calm to try to establish better policies for the medium and long term. We're not going to find an immediate solution to everything in the next few years, certainly not on immigration, but because of where we find ourselves, we do have a chance, I think, that if people are thoughtful on both sides, we recognize that it is in the interest of both nations to work this as best as possible, recognizing that we're never going to see perfectly eyeball to eyeball, but that we have a vested interest in working together. With some luck, we can be in a far better positions a few years from now. And I think that's what we should try to do.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I think that this situation, I think it is so true that this crisis has exposed and educated even those of us who work in these fields, how incredibly interdependent we are, especially in food and on these supply chain issues. And I think it's becoming quite clear in general to the American public that the idea of denoting people as essential workers, I mean, actually having them carry letters, pieces of paper that say you're essential to the functioning of the American economy, but you have no legal status in the United States, that is just an unacceptable situation. And I think that it does create the predicate for a different level of understanding about what needs to happen at a policy level going forward. But it is also, I'm glad that Gerónimo talked about this in more, I agree about the more near term here. This is not something that will happen in 3 to 6 months. This is something that will need to be part of a broader reckoning that needs to take place, certainly, I believe will take place in this country, about the danger of disease, how disease as a security threat and as a threat to our economic well-being, how we change lots of different policies and attitudes to incorporate it, and we need to be sure that immigration is part of that.
Thank you both so much. I know that we want to be respectful of your time. We're at the 12:30 hour. I think we could go on and on with this conversation. We were struggling even to narrow down some of the topics that we cover. Enrique, if you don't mind, there's just one question that I would love just a brief answer from both of you. And then I would encourage everybody who has been with us and watching us online as well. We'll have follow-up information certainly on the Sign Institute, the U.S. Mexico Foundation, for questions we didn't get to. And I'm sure we're going to try to find ways to work with both of you again to continue the conversation. But so much of this has been about the challenges. And Sarah brought up a really good point. I think sometimes we're all looking so much for, some positive light. Do you see any opportunities that could surface as we're dealing with this pandemic, as we're going through, that might have made itself more available to us, having gone through this together, both countries? Doris?
Well, I think they are the ones that Gerónimo and I have been talking about. I mean, this is such a mega event that it requires everybody to stand back and reassess. And the U.S. Mexico relationship is part of that reassessment because of the enormous numbers of ways and layers in which our countries are interdependent. It includes migration, it includes food, it includes supply chains, it includes geography and so forth. So all of us who are active in these fields, I think, need to participate as fully as we can in being sure that that reassessment and that rethinking does include these issues where we've seen such anomalies for such a long time that need to be rationalized.
Amy, what I would say is that something that I've learned after 20 years of working in the U.S.-Mexico relationship is that reality tends to impose itself on both sides. And therefore, what we often find is governments lagging behind and trying to catch up with certain reality that is going on between the two countries. And I think that we have especially survived, if I may use that term, some very difficult past years. There was, a risk of losing our trade agreement just a few years ago. And there have been very difficult, public expressions on the part of President Trump with respect to Mexico in the past. And those have somewhat softened because I think there is greater knowledge that we are interdependent in many ways. And I think that if that is recognized, and that does not mean that we're going to agree on everything, by no means. But if we recognize that we're working together, we are in most cases better off. And that we recognize that there is a very complex geopolitical situation in the world and in the world economy, I think that is an opportunity. Because why complicate what I would say, and I'll stop there, why complicate the North American relationship when you see so many other problems worldwide? In spite of the differences and difficulties, we have a fairly good situation in North America, and we need to take advantage of that in some of the areas that we have already talked about.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your time again. I know that we could spend a lot more, and maybe we'll invite you back for a follow-up as this evolves. I would appreciate that. Enrique, I don't know if you have any final words, but we want to thank you again for your time today and certainly look forward to talking to you in the future. Enrique?
Thank you very much.
Just to thank you, Amy, and the Sign Institute and the American University to open this dialogue, and it has been amazing. Thank you for all the audience. And well, thank you, the speakers, Gerónimo, Doris, thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
All the best. Look forward to talking to you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Bye-bye.